There's a question that many of us ask ourselves. That is, where do we come from? Some believe a spiritual God created them, others think the way of nature made them. In this video, I'd like to give you a simplistic understanding of what science thinks happened to spawn life. Abiogenesis. A meaning not, bio meaning living, and genesis meaning origin. Put it all together, not living origin. This is going from inorganic matter to a biological protocell. Let's look a little closer. We don't really consider a protocell living, but it can do three precursor actions that mimics life. These are means of metabolism, breaking down molecules for energy, hypothesized to have occurred at the hydrothermal vents with sulfur-rich compounds. Having a separation from the external environment using amphithetic lipids. These lipids are hydrophobic and hydrophilic in certain regions, allowing it to form a naturally occurring spherical structure which separates it from the environment. And also means of replication using simple molecules like RNA. Protocell probably used this to replicate itself through means of binary fission of sorts, maybe even something more simple than that. But one might ask, but where did the matter from the protocell come from? It's said to have originated from what's called a primordial soup, or in other words, a mixture of organic matter. However, there's a slight problem. If you know anything about chemical thermodynamics, you know entropy would be a big issue here. Entropy is the measure of disorder in a system, and in the universe, reactions that increase entropy or disorder are favored. So how is it that we made extremely ordered protocells spontaneously? Well, it's not known yet, but lightning is said to be a potential catalyst. To help us understand, let's look at the famous Miller-Urey experiment. Stanley Miller and Harold Urey in the 1950s wanted to prove that you could create organic matter from inorganic simple molecules. In this experiment, simple gaseous molecules, those simple molecules, hypothesized to be remnants of the prebiotic Earth, were zapped with a spark, and that spark simulated lightning. What they found is that amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, formed. This showed science that you could in fact create ordered matter spontaneously. Although Miller and Urey were wrong, they were the first ones who kicked off the massive search for the origin of life. It's also important to point out the RNA world hypothesis, which states that the world was simply replicating RNA molecules before the protocell. These RNA molecules are known as ribozymes, which function as an enzyme and genetic material. These features may have allowed these RNA molecules to undergo evolution by natural selection, even potentially before the protocell was formed. This is another way abiogenesis is viewed and is a feasible explanation for the origin of life. Now we have life, but what comes next? To answer this, we need to understand the theory of evolution by natural selection. Charles Darwin, a naturalist, boarded the HMS Beagle in 1831, and on this trip, he made a series of observations that would lead him to the theory of evolution by natural selection. During his voyage, he stopped at an island called the Galapagos. On this island, he would capture wildlife. When he looked at the island's finches, he observed that they differed from the mainland species of finches. His first observation is variation among species. He also observed that species on the island make more offspring that then can survive. This was his second observation. And for his last observation, he noticed that species seem to be well adapted to their environments. He noticed, for example, finches that had slender, long beaks are better at picking up insects, while finches with stubby, thick beaks are better for cracking open nuts. Depending on the food source and the environment, he would notice that the respective species would be present there. Using his observations, he inferred that species change over time depending on the environment they are placed in. Charles Darwin came up with the theory of natural selection, which is, if a trait is favorable to an organism's survival, then it is more likely to survive and pass on the trait to the next generation. This theory of evolution by natural selection went against everything society thought was true. In the 1800s, when it was published, people mainly believed in God, and that God created them, not means of nature. So he kept his theory quiet. Until a man named Alfred Wallace developed the exact same theory as Darwin, independently. When Wallace came to Darwin, he knew it was time for them to publish their ideas, so Darwin published his book on the origin of species. The book was an instant staple of controversy. Some believed it, while others were arrogant for their beliefs. And this is still true today. So how do we apply this to the protocell? It's very simple. You look at the first protocell, and through means of natural selection and mutations to its genetic material, they differentiate from each other, and this is the basic idea of speciation. As the protocell speciated more and more, new life arose. Let's look at the history of life now. When you look at the phylogenetic tree of life, we have Luca, our last universal common ancestor. And then the tree branches, which shows speciation. The first speciation event was between archaea and bacteria. Both are prokaryotic, simple cells, but archaea can survive in more harsh environments, whereas bacteria can only survive in calmer environments. From this, archaea speciated to make eukaryotic species. Eukaryotes are more complex cells with a nucleus and inner membrane system, and evolved to have mitochondria and in some species of eukaryotes chloroplasts. But how did this evolve? To understand first mitochondrial origins, we have to understand the endosymbiotic theory. Endosymbiosis says that archaic cells engulfed another prokaryotic cell and forms a symbiotic relationship where the engulfed cell begins to make energy for the larger cell, and through many generations becomes the main energy machine of eukaryotes. This, of course, is favored by natural selection, as the mitochondria does cellular respiration, a process turning glucose into energy, ATP. The same endosymbiotic relationship is also the origin of the chloroplast, where a glucose-producing cell using sunlight as a catalyst was engulfed by another cell. As for the inner membrane system origins, it's said to have originated from the engulfment of vesicles, which happened to form an arrangement that is favorable by natural selection, and over time, many organelles, such as the nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi body, just to name a few, have evolved. The first eukaryotes are said to be protists. A protist is what we classify as the oddball of eukaryotic cells. This is because they do not form multicellularly. Cannot say that word. Rather, they exhibit unicellularity. The bridge to modern cells was multicellularity. But before we get into the more complex eukaryotes, it's important to point out that they say protists held the origin of meiosis. This is a form of sexual reproduction. The key here is the mechanism of meiosis leads to extreme genetic diversity among individuals, which leads to an increased number of traits among a population. During prophase 1, chromosomes form tetrads, which form a synaptic complex, and in the synaptic complex, they're going to swap segments of DNA among the chromosomes, and thus leading to what we call recombinant chromosomes. Another process is independent assortment, which sorts the chromosomes differently of each daughter cell. The combination of these two processes leads to an endless number of variations among individuals, or pretty much endless. For humans, for example, we can independently assort our chromosomes 8 million ways. Another feature that animals, plants, and fungi cells acquired is the ability to do mitosis, a more complex version of binary fission or replication. In mitosis, it's a process that neatly organizes the complex chromosomes and the high number of chromosomes that we see in eukaryotes. The more complex mitosis may seem a little unfavored by natural selection due to, we would assume, a higher energy expenditure required. However, mitosis increases the fitness or the ability to reproduce of individuals, as it lowers the risk of unequal distribution of those intense high number of chromosomes. As we get more complex on the genetic side of things, so do organisms. Cells begin to form multicellularly into tissues, and those tissues begin to form organisms. This was a big step. Multicellularity, as we just saw, was cells coming together, and the ability for cells to join together allowed life to get bigger. To understand how complex life was getting, let's take a look at one of my personal favorite eras of life, the Cambrian period. We refer to the Cambrian period as the Cambrian explosion, as sea life exploded in its diversity. Macro-level predation occurred, and therefore natural selection took a major effect here. It's here we saw things like body armor, mobility structures, burrowing, and most interesting of all, eyes evolve. Some notable species during this time was trilobites and Namacaris, I believe that's how you say that, sponges, and jellyfish. Life continued to evolve, and aquatic species became more and more complex. During this time, so much photosynthesis from algae and other photosynthesizing plants has occurred that a protective blanket of air filled the environment. This allowed some microbial species to colonize the land. This was then followed by small bugs and vegetation. But this begs the question, what about the animals? Ichthyostica, an amphibious animal, developed the trait of being a tetrapod. As you can see in the diagram, the phylogenetic tree shows over many generations, legs and arms evolved. This allowed big animals to take its first steps on land, like the Ichthyostica. Throughout the Carboniferous period, all the way to the Jurassic period, reptiles got really big, and this was also the age of the dinosaurs. To keep things short, however, a big meteor hit these dinosaurs and killed all of them. But a few survivors remained on land, such as frogs, salamanders, and grasses, of course, bugs, all that still remained, just the dinosaurs were knocked out. But even though the dinosaurs died, a new dominant species began to arise, and this was the mammal. So what makes a mammal a mammal? A mammal must be warm-blooded, have a backbone, have fur, 4 limbs, feed their young with milk, along with some other features. So what was the first mammal? The Morganucodon, the first true mammal. Quite an ugly creature that resembles that of a rat or a mouse. Had all the features we just talked about, and this is known as our common ancestor for all mammals, as we know of. Mammals got more and more diverse in the number of unique mammal species. One order began to evolve only 150 million years later after the first mammal appeared, which quickly became the dominant species, something we know as primates. Much like animals, but have higher neuron density and a larger cortex volume. We ourselves are primates, and as we see from our early primates to now, the brain has continued to develop larger and more complex. But why is this? While some species evolved predation-prey features as to avoid getting preyed upon or to help them prey on things, primates did things a little differently. With the brain, we can make more complex decisions, which was a niche that seemed to work out pretty well.
Now that we know where our species comes from, let's take a 360 turn and look at the more specific origins that shape the world around us. Have you ever seen the large monstrous creatures that live very deep in the ocean? With pressures above 400 atmospheres, you'd think no life could possibly live in this part of the world, and yet it does. Some species evolved a niche to withstand these pressures. Take for example the anglerfish, a very hideous, very scary species in the deep which uses an influx of water to balance out the pressure, something we humans couldn't do. On the screen you'll see many species of the deep, and honestly I find it quite terrifying myself. Most of these species are large and well adapted to those pressures. Something I'm curious about is what lives even lower. We don't know yet, but we have seen such, for example, whales that have been attacked by some species from even deeper below, said to have been attacked by a massive squid. Moving on, I'd like to talk about the origin of viruses. We don't consider viruses living. This is in part due to the fact that they cannot reproduce or make energy on their own, and they rely on a host to facilitate/supply the necessary resources to do so. So if it's not life, where did these pests come from? There are many hypotheses, which you can find videos on all of them, but my favorite is the regression model, which states that not too long after the first protocells were evolved and made, some cells evolved to be more like parasites, which preyed upon the perfectly biotic cells. This to me explains that evolutionary favorability, which is why I like the regression models so much. It just explains the very simple nature and how they evolve that kind of niche in the environment.
You've likely seen a tardigrade, whereas they're well-known water bears. They are a small, bear-like microorganism species. But what makes these creatures so special? An adaptation to the water bear includes cryptobiosis, the ability to become dormant. This allows the water bear to live in extreme environments like space or in ice caps or any environment that's just too hard to live in or to find nutrients in. These features likely evolved due to the extreme environmental pressures given the environment they lived in, like salty water, O2 deficient areas, and cold environments. This allowed traits that keep energy conserved longer to increase in frequency among their species, which to me is just fascinating. The moral of this section is that life is weird and involves very weird traits and features. Some of it's ugly, some of it's beautiful, but it all occurs for a reason. Species make do with what they have. And although the beauty of life is great, the takeover of human beings is causing a not well-known ticking time bomb to brew. The world's human population is currently 8.1 billion individuals as of 2024. The maximum population we can stand without running out of resources to live like an average American is 2.0 billion. If you consider the minimum for everyone to survive with the food supply we have now, we could sustain only 10.6 billion. I predict that sooner or later, with the growth of humans that we have on Earth, we will start to run out of food and our population will see a steep decline. I do think there will be many ways to counteract this. Limiting the number of kids in each family could be one thing. China has tried it and it caused underpopulation, which achieves the goal that we would want to have occur. I really hope we do figure out a way to combat this problem. Not a lot of people talk about it, it's not mainstream yet, but I'm sure one day it will be, but by then it will be too late. And with that, I conclude this video. This was a project for my AP Biology course that I'm taking, and I thank you so much for watching this video. I have a love for biology, evolution, and seeking the origin of life. I hope that in the years to come I will improve my knowledge and become a biochemist. If there is one thing you should take away from this video, it is that life around you is interconnected and united through genes of which you share derived from a single common ancestor. Thank you so much for watching.